Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
And I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
Let's see. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining me today. We are back doing Facebook Lives. We heard the calls from our supporters and our families that really enjoyed these. We heard the calls from professionals like my guest today, Darrell Price. And we're excited to get these back and feel like the new year, a new opportunity. And I'm honored to have my guest, Darrell Price, with me today. I want to tell a little bit of a backstory about how we met and why we're doing this and why we feel like this is important. So a few years ago, like back in 2017, I presented at the first cold case conference I was asked to present at, and Darrell Price was there, and we met down in St. Pete Beach at the Postcard Inn at a conference. And I met some amazing people that I've maintained friendships and relationships with over those years. And our paths have crossed a few times, and we've kept in touch over the years. And then most recently, we were together in Philadelphia just a couple months ago. And you came to me and said, I love watching those Facebook Lives when you do them. When are you going to start doing those again? And we started getting calls from families that were saying the exact same thing. Like we really gain a lot of information from those Facebook Lives, start them up again. And so here we are, 2022, and we're going to do it. And no one better than you, Darrell, to start us off. You currently work for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, and you have worked for them for a number of years now. So as an introduction, you are now the sergeant of the cold case unit with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. But give us a little background on when you started in Charlotte and how many years, when you went into homicide, and what you do now.
Thanks, Ryan, and thank you for what you do, because I know that everybody loves having a voice for everyone. And to me, you speak for a lot of different people. So thank you for what you do. Yeah, as Ryan said, I've been with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department for 41 years. Yes, I'm very old. For those of you who are wondering, why are you so old still doing this job? But basically, I work out of an office, and I have detectives that do all the hard work. But so, yeah, 41 years, and most of those have been in a detective role. I became a homicide detective in the early 90s, and then eventually left homicide, got promoted, and then came back as a detective sergeant. And during that time, we developed a cold case unit. And then when I retired in 2010, the chief hired me back to run the cold case unit. And so I think Ryan may have put somewhere that I supervise both sex crimes and homicide cold case. And so we're going to focus today mostly on the homicide stuff. But
yeah.
So, yeah, I've been doing this. Let's see, I came back in 2010 as the full-time cold case person.
And immediately when I met you, your passion for solving the cases was evident. And I don't think anybody, you probably hear that a lot from people, but as a family member, as somebody that lost a loved one to homicide, sometimes we kind of get bogged down in a detective doesn't care. I don't hear from them. Nobody's doing anything. And for me, as you know, I have had a seat at the table with law enforcement, and I have been able to sit with you both publicly and privately, and a number of other detectives, cold case homicide detectives that we both know, and learn that there are some amazing detectives out there, obviously you being one of them, that are as passionate as I am, and I obviously have a vested interest in cold case homicides and solving them. But what really stuck out to me was your knowledge of what survivors are going through and your empathy and compassion towards them. I've never once heard you belittle a family or say they bother you, or that you wish they didn't call, or can they just get over it, or any of those other things that sometimes as survivors we start to think in our head that must be what they just want me to go away. They don't want me to keep calling. They don't want to solve my loved one's case. And for me, to be around you and some of these other detectives that we know and see that that's not the case, that there is a commitment there, and obviously, not every detective is perfect and not every detective is as committed. But 41 years in law enforcement, you've retired, they've brought you back. I mean, I fear the day where you finally do say, I just want to go fishing. I don't want to do this anymore, because I know there's a lot of great detectives out there, but I don't know how many Darrell Prices there are out there. And so this opportunity for me to talk with you live, with other people, with survivors that can chime in and ask us questions. It's something that really excites me and motivates me, and it inspires me. And I hope you will keep doing this as long as you can, because I don't want to see you go. And I love being at conferences where you are inspiring the younger generation of detectives, and where they come out of there and they go, I want to do that. I want to be like Darrell Price. I want to work in this, and I want to solve these cases. Your Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department was also, at least in my opinion and from what I have seen, they kind of led the charge, and allowed you some freedoms that some agencies don't have, or some agencies are hesitant about. This unit that you supervise, again, we're going to talk more just about the specific homicide cases, but you also do sexual assault cold cases. But for homicides, you have 2 full-time detectives, 2 part-time detectives, and 6 volunteers. And you've shared with me a little bit that those volunteers, you share with our viewers who those volunteers are, what they represent, and then what they do in your unit.
Yeah, so our volunteers, so they're made up of various segments. So some are retired FBI agents that have retired and they want to come back to help out to review cold cases. I have a former criminal justice professor, a former analyst, and then I have 4 of them are former FBI agents, a former professor and a former analyst. So what they do is we give them a case that we want to review, and they take that case and spend 6 months with it. They go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and then they come back in and they do a full presentation to the team, and then we make suggestions, and we look at the case as a whole, and then we develop a to-do list. And then that way, when they're done with it, I hand it off to a detective, and it's ready to be worked.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm sure there are other agencies that utilize those resources. I know, like Seminole County in Florida has called in some old retired detectives to review cold cases. I know there's some others, but I don't know that they've utilized it, as efficiently and effectively as you guys have in Charlotte. And how many cold cases, homicides do you know of in Charlotte-Mecklenburg in that jurisdiction?
Well, I think the better answer is that I know of, because when I'm asked that question, my problem is how far back do I go?
Right.
Because obviously you can't go back to the 1700s. So
right.
if I look back over the last 40 years and kind of extrapolate a number of workable open homicides, there's usually somewhere between 700 and 800.
Yeah.
And that's a lot. And, going back to your original statement about how communication between a detective or someone and that the victim's parents or the spouses or the brothers or the sisters go, sometimes I have failed at that miserably, because you get caught up in so many cases. and you fail to think about the fact that, hey, it's coming up on this person's birthday or a holiday, and those are the hardest times for victims' families. But I have failed at that. I can't sit here and say I'm perfect, but I did want to say, though, that I have one young lady who was murdered, and her father would call me very regularly, and he basically just said, look, I know you don't have anything new to tell me, but it's comforting for you to call me because you are my connection to my daughter. And so I think if people kind of let their detectives know that that's the reason, they just want to be talked to because they're the last connection that they have to their loved one, that might help that detective understand a little better.
Yeah, I think I've heard you tell that story before too, and it's so true. It's like, we know you'll call us if there's an arrest, and if an arrest is being made or an arrest is imminent, it's all of those other nights that we're laying there awake and that we're just wondering, does anybody think about my loved one anymore? Does anybody, is there anything I can do? Is there anything about, one of the things as survivors, we've lost total control when there's a homicide investigation. We can't control what evidence is left behind. We can't control how far technology has advanced so that evidence can be tested. We can't control how cooperative witnesses are. We can't control how advanced and competent the investigator is. And we really have to rely on our detective that they are going to know all those things. And the second there is a technology that is out there, or the second there is a witness to talk to, that they'll do that. And it really is comforting. My dad was murdered in 2009, and at the 10-year anniversary of his murder, the lead detective on his case retired the same week as that anniversary. And we had maintained a good relationship and communication over the years. And I didn't call him often, but occasionally I would. But the emotion I felt when I knew I couldn't do that anymore was really kind of overwhelming. And I thought, I've had this person that I could go to that I knew would answer my call and I knew would just talk to me, like you said. And if ever some strange idea popped into my head, respectfully, I would call him, during business hours, not in the middle of the night or something, but I would call him and he would talk me through why something was done or wasn't done or, something like that. And when he was gone, and after that period of time, most of the investigators I had met through my dad's case had gone and either retired or promoted and were not in the unit anymore. It was difficult, and I remember just thinking, like, man, I don't have a connection in law enforcement to my dad anymore. Everybody's retired and everybody's, out of the unit. And that's a difficult place. But I think, you nail it when you say these families, they just want to know that there's somebody there and that, their loved one is remembered and that you think about them occasionally and that these cases resonate with you and I know this from knowing you for a few years now, that like these are not just dusty boxes on a shelf somewhere, for you. They're not for us, obviously, but they're not for you either. And every time I'm in a training where you're a part of, and I see you share that, and inspire others to treat these cases that same way, like they are somebody's loved one, and let's treat the case that way. Yeah,
and I get reminded all the time because being in law enforcement, I think of them as a case, but it's a person. I mean, it's not just a box or it's not just a file. It's a person, and it's a life. And it's not only that; it's the people that they've left behind. So this one box or this one file contains the hearts of a bunch of people, and it takes a long time to figure that out. So, I've watched several of your Facebook Lives, and I've seen some of the comments, and I realize the heartache that's going on out there with some of the family members. And, all I can say to you is try to build that bridge with those detectives or that agency as best you can, because they may not understand. They may not realize everything they need to realize.
Yeah. Well, I want to share, like, we've had a bunch of people already comment. There was I can pull this up on the screen and you'll recognize this lovely face, Angela Williamson, two of my favorite cold cases people. And Angela, I credit for having a seat, with law enforcement, because she recognized, she was at that same conference in St. Pete Beach, and she saw my presentation and she recognized the value in what Project Cold Case was doing. And she has, more times than I'm sure she would admit, she has used us as a resource and thought of us when somebody was having problems. And I'm forever in debt and grateful to Angela. And I know you have a great relationship with her too.
Yeah, I can honestly tell you that if it weren't for Angela, I would probably be retired by now, because, Angela has really helped us through the sexual assault portion of the cold case. Because for those of you that don't know, Angela works for BJA, and one of her big projects is SACI, the Sexual Assault Kid Initiative. And she's been more than a friend to me. I mean, I think of, honestly, and this is not an exaggeration, I would have already quit had it not been for Angela.
Well, I owe her another thank you for that too. And she has brought me into that world, because there's a lot of overlap in those sexual assault cold cases that then are also homicides. And she has told me many times she sees the value in expanding resources for homicide cold cases as well. And so we're all on the same page, and we have, I'm proud to say that we've sat together on a number of occasions and worked hard behind the scenes to try to make sure that there's resources available, and that if there's an agency somewhere that needs help with a cold case unit, they can call you. If there's an agency out there that needs help with advocacy, they can call me. And together, we make that difference. You and I were talking before we went live, and let me get to this question first. Shannon asked, what do you consider an unworkable case? So when you were describing how many cases are out there and what you consider, open workable cases, I think that's a great question, because these are the things that families don't necessarily know. And we educate them, and we become educated, myself included, and that helps us, through the process. So can you share a little bit?
Yeah, and that's not as complex as it sounds. I didn't mean for that to sound like if we had a case that's 10 years old, it's unworkable. I'm thinking more in terms of a case from the 40s or the 50s. I get a call occasionally about someone's grandfather or great-grandfather that was murdered in the 40s and 50s. And if we're lucky enough to find that case file, which is unique, because back in those days, you didn't have filing systems. Basically, the detectives used to take those cases home with them.
Yeah.
But if we're lucky enough to find it, we can't find our evidence, or everybody's dead that worked the case. So you don't have that chain of custody to get evidence admitted into a trial. They basically become unworkable at that point. It's almost impossible to work without the lead detectives that worked it at the time, physical evidence, the original files. I mean, that's what I meant by unworkable.
Yeah, it's almost unprosecutable too. Like
it would be very unprosecutable.
Yeah, if it's unprosecutable, then how do you actually solve it? And we've seen those cases where key witnesses have died, suspects have died. Like you say, unfortunately, the longer it goes, the more likely something's lost, the more likely something's contaminated or degraded, evidence-wise. And I think it's good to clarify. I'm glad Shannon asked that question, because you're not considering a case that, and I don't know what Charlotte, CMPD, what you consider a case once it's cold and you're not working it actively anymore. In Jacksonville, they suspend it. They call it administratively suspending a case, because they're not closing it, because it's a homicide. So it's not closed, but it's not active either. So they call it suspended. And what you're not saying is that when you get to that point in an investigation where you're not going to make an arrest and it's no longer active, that doesn't mean it can't become active later. Because what we know is that technology changes and witnesses come forward, and there's a lot of reasons why a case that wasn't being investigative actively 3 years ago could tomorrow be the hottest case in your office, right?
Yeah, and we have great examples of that, and we don't really inactivate cases here or close them unless they're solved. And a good example is without going into a lot of detail, we've been working on a case off and on over the years for 31 years. And Angela was a big help in that because I took it and I presented it all over the country to different groups, and finally got the right suggestion on some technology that we really hadn't been using. So sometimes I tell families that technology may catch up with your case. Like, for instance, in that particular case, we reworked old evidence that had been worked in the 90s with newer science. It's more sensitive equipment, basically. The science is similar, but the equipment is much more sensitive. So without going into great detail, because that case is still being held pretty tight to her chest, but we reprocessed some evidence that had been processed. So we thought we knew the answers, but when we reprocessed it, we got a whole different answer.
Yeah.
So sometimes, even if a case sits for months and nobody picks it up and looks at it, we're still thinking about it daily. Like, what can we do? Is there a new science? And I think most of your audience stays pretty well educated on some of the newer technologies like forensic genetic genealogy. That's the newest, shiniest tool on the tool belt.
Yeah. So
we just got a grant through Angela to do forensic genetic genealogy, and we have actually a homicide case right now that we met with Parabon yesterday on, and it's a sexually motivated homicide. So we were able to use SACI funding to look at it.
Yeah.
So genealogy is the newest tool.
And
3 years ago, that sounded like voodoo.
Right. And I saw earlier that Jennifer Moore from Innovative Forensic Investigations is on here too, and her company does investigative genetic genealogy. And I know you've talked to her in the past as well. And I think, sometimes we get so wrapped up in the newest technology that we forget that old technology is still advancing too. We went through a span here in Jacksonville where the cold cases that were being solved were the evidence was fingerprints, that just the technology had advanced for better scanning of fingerprints and reading of fingerprints. We even had a guy just walk in after 18 years and confess at the sheriff's office. I always tell people, that's not very likely, but it's happened, and this isn't the only time it's ever happened. So you never give up hope. But as a detective, again, relying on investigators and detectives to remember that, genealogy is not your only tool in the tool belt. You still gotta think about fingerprints, and sometimes those get, kind of forgotten because we almost feel like that technology is antiquated, and it's advancing still too.
Well, one of the great things about fingerprints now, Ryan, is that now there's labs that can separate the tape from the paper on a fingerprint card and get DNA out of the skin cells. So fingerprints can be more than fingerprints. They can be used as DNA.
Exactly.
And so there's so many little tools, and that's why I mentioned earlier that, if you want to get to this in just a few minutes, the fact that I had offered that Machia would be willing to help people out. But
this is a great segue in that, actually, because we got this comment, Darrell. Is there a group out there the cold case detectives can contact for assistance with a case?
Absolutely. And this, Ryan and I were talking earlier, and I belong to a group called the Mid-Atlantic Cold Case Homicide Investigators Association. And I think Ryan will put up the website so you can pull it up and look at it.
Figure out how to do that. You keep talking. I'll try to.
So what we do is we try to help review cold cases all across the country. So if you can get your detective, if they need help looking at a case, if they want to contact either Chris Flanagan or myself, what we'll do is contact them, and maybe we can do a video chat with them and talk about the case a little bit and explain what we would like to happen. But ideally, giving us some of the documentation so we can look it over. We can look over the evidence to make sure that everything that has been done or can be done has been done. one of the main things that I want everybody out there to call their detective and ask them is, has my case been entered into VICAP? That has lacked for so long. The ability, or detectives entering a case into VICAP is the bare minimum that should be done. And VICAP is the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. And it's a database where they enter the specifics of your case so that if that case matches to another case, they can be kind of compared, and it really helps in the investigation. So that'd be the first thing I'd ask. And secondly, if they really need help with that case, if they'll contact someone at the Mid-Atlantic Cold Case Homicide Investigators Association, we'll be more than happy to talk to them to see what we can do to help them with that case. And obviously all of this is at no cost. We're willing to do what we need to do to help out to solve cases. So,
yeah. So that's coldcasehomicides.org is the website that I'm showing. Hopefully everybody is seeing that. And there's Darrell there with an email address. So, for you cold case detectives out there, utilize that resource. For those survivors out there and families, reach out to your detective and ask if they would consider a resource like that. Particularly, we talked about this, Darrell, that agencies that have dedicated cold case units may not see the value as much in sharing that information with you at Machia, but certainly agencies that are smaller and don't have dedicated units or don't have dedicated cold case detectives.
I see, Ryan, where John Elliott put up the web address here. John's on our board as well. So
perfect.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And to say this, I know Ryan had blown me up really big in the beginning of this conversation. I'm really not that Columbo guy. Everything that we do collectively. So, I would be nothing without my coworkers and my friends with these organizations that really help evolve me, and hopefully I'll help evolve them through the how to be a homicide detective process. So just know that the Machia group, we're all law enforcement. Everything that would come through there, if you need assistance, we would be willing to sign confidentiality agreements. So you wouldn't have to worry about that. But again, if you or your detective, now obviously this request will have to come through law enforcement because we would need access to some of the information to be able to do a decent review. But like I said, obviously you want to make sure that your case has been entered into VICAP too.
Yeah. And this is, obviously great information and an opportunity for families, but also detectives. We struggle. We have 31,000 people that like our Facebook page and that watch these videos, and we have a cross section. We provide information to survivors. So the comments here is, survivor after survivor commenting, but then there's law enforcement responding, and it's just, I love this opportunity for us to share this information with all parties involved in these investigations, from the family all the way up to the detective. And I think that it's just a really unique opportunity that I'm certainly proud and honored that we have this opportunity to share them.
And I want to ask Ryan, I got to apologize to anybody that might be asking me a question. I really can't see the comments that well.
It's very difficult. If you see me look into the side of the screen, I'm literally trying to read through comments and post, and share them if it's something.
So if anyone has asked me anything specific, I probably haven't seen it. So
I'm trying to keep up. I didn't know that we had shared that web address because it was farther down the chat that John shared that I had gotten to. But I have my own list of questions here too. But I see some of the really great questions, and so this is an easy one for you, Darrell. To be an investigator, doesn't one need to be a police officer first? And maybe you can share that process.
Yeah, so I asked that question of my father in 1980 when he said, "Do you want to be a police officer?" And I said, "I just want to be a detective. Can I just do that?" And he said, "Well, you're going to have to spend a few years being a police officer to learn how to do that before you can be a detective." So the short answer is you really have to go through police academy. You got to become a police officer. And, after whatever period of time those departments allow, then you can become a detective at that point. Now, generally speaking, you don't become a homicide detective right off. You become a detective of maybe property crimes or something, and you kind of work your way up. But it's not something you can walk through the door, go to the police academy, and come out as a homicide detective. That's really not.
Yeah. And I mean, there's good reason for that as well, right? I mean, you got to get some experience under your belt, and then, and have some understanding of law enforcement and interactions with the public and those kinds of things. And so there are reasons for it. Let me see. So what do you do at Charlotte-Mecklenburg when a family member calls up and just asks for an update? Like maybe say it's been 5-10 years since you've heard from anybody. I mean, you've been there long enough now that there's been some consistency. When they call up and ask for Sergeant Price, you're still there. I mean, a lot of our families call up and ask for Detective so-and-so, and he's transferred, promoted, retired, whatever. So a lot of times, we encourage families to call either the cold case unit or, the homicide unit if there's not a dedicated cold case unit, and ask to speak to the supervisor and then ask for an update. So how does your unit handle that?
So those calls sometimes can be difficult for me because of the, say, 700 we have open, we've reviewed a little over 200 of those. And that's a full comprehensive review of those 200. So as long as it's one of those 200, if somebody calls me, I'm pretty familiar with those cases. If it's a case we haven't reviewed yet, there's a chance that I don't know a lot about that case. So those are the ones that are hard for me because I understand coming from the other end of the phone call. When you call me and I say, I'm really not that familiar with that case, can you give me just a little bit of time and I'll call you back? And then I become familiar with it and call them back and say, look, we haven't been working it, but I can assure you today this case will get reviewed and we're going to do a full review on it. So if you're a loved one of a victim and you feel like that's your case, I do suggest calling and saying, could you please just take a look at this case?
Yeah. And I forgot what I was going to ask you there, but so a lot of times when we're encouraging families, we say, ask them to give it a cursory review just to see when the last time it was, fully looked at. And just what you said, ask them to do a full case review. So first, my question is, since you have taken over the cold case unit, did you start it? Did they not have a cold case unit when they brought you back, or was that?
So I started the sexual assault cold case unit in 2006, but the homicide cold case unit was started in 2003.
Okay.
So when I came back in 2010, I took over both units.
Okay. Gotcha.
So the homicide unit was already running by the time I came back.
Do you know how many cases you guys have reviewed as a unit? I mean, maybe not total, but over the last couple of years, Well, like I said, we do about one a month. And I mean, just extrapolating that since I've been back 12 years or 11 years. So you'd think, a little over 100. And do you know how many you've been able to solve or make an arrest in?
I wasn't prepared to give the exact number, but we've solved about 4 or 5 cases a year.
Okay. So out of reviewing 12 a year, you average 12 cases a year reviewed, average of, 4 or so solves a year. That's an incredible rate.
Well, and the ones that we're solving might not be the ones we're reviewing. It might be the ones we reviewed 2 or 3 years ago.
Sure.
And, but then again, if I had 3 times the number of detectives, we'd solve more cases. And don't get me wrong, just in case my boss is listening, we've gotten great support from our department.
Yeah.
We're probably one of the few departments that I can say we get to work cold cases and nothing else. Because I have friends all over the country that do cold case work, and they tell me constantly they get pulled for officer-involved shootings. They get pulled for hot homicide. So they get pulled left and right. You know, my detectives, I never have to pull them for outside cases. They work strictly cold cases. So we get a lot of support here, and that is what is absolutely needed to run a good cold case unit.
I agree. I mean, a lot of times cold case units have the most experienced detectives, because they do have all of that investigative experience over the years. But when they have those added responsibilities, it's always a struggle for me to come to terms with this. Cold cases are not always a priority in law enforcement. And when you do dedicate a unit to them, you're showing that you do find value in there and that they are a priority. But then when you add the officer-involved shootings, the in-custody deaths, the child abduction response team, like all of those things, when they happen, become the number one priority in the agency. If there's an officer-involved shooting, there is nothing more important than investigating that officer-involved shooting. And so that drops the priority of the cold case unit. And when you call it a dedicated cold case unit, but they are responsible for all of these other things, and then when all of those other things are a higher priority than the cases your dedicated unit is supposed to investigate, that's a hard pill to swallow. To me, it's there's a difference there, Yeah.
And just to give everyone an idea, like if you get pulled for an officer-involved shooting, you're out of work for 3 months. I mean, easily, you'll not do any more work other than that for 3 months. So it takes you out for a quarter of the year. Yeah. And so you can't run a cold case unit properly by doing that. Yeah. And everybody knows that, but I do understand, especially today, there's such a shortage of officers and detectives and all across the country. I mean, there's a shortage. So, but that, it's still no excuse. If something's worth doing, it's worth doing it well.
That's true. And, there are other jurisdictions where there's, city charters that don't allow detectives, police officers that retire to come back to work at the agency. So while that is an amazing resource and a lost opportunity for those agencies, that they can't call back somebody like you that had all those years of experience and bring them back to do it. And there are a number of jurisdictions in Florida that don't allow that for double dipping pension, purposes. But I think Charlotte's figured out a way to do it. I think there's obviously a way to rewrite those charters or rewrite those ordinances that would allow detectives to come back and either not get a second pension or, whatever the case may be. I don't know all the specifics, but I know that there's agencies that are able to rehire retired detectives, and then there's other agencies that aren't, and that's frustrating as well. Let me ask you another question about families. You've been doing this for so long. You've worked with families. Has a family reaching out to you led to an arrest? And I don't mean like with information on a suspect. I mean, like if they called you up and just said, "Hey, I was a child when my dad was murdered. Nobody really told me what was going on. Will you pull the file and review it and tell me what happened?" And then you pulled the file and you look at it and you go, "Geez, this, I'm going to assign this to one of our volunteers because there's stuff here that hasn't been done in 15 years or whatever."
Yeah, absolutely on that one. I mean, we've pulled numbers of, we get calls and one of the questions you had told me that you thought you were going to ask is how do we pick and choose what cases we review? So I can tell everyone 90% of it is the phone calls that I get or the emails that I get, because we have a website at the police department and my email is on that website. So anybody can email me and my phone number's there. So if I get a call or an email saying, my father was murdered, my mother was murdered, my husband, wife, or whatever, could you take a look at that case and get back in touch with me? So we pull the file and then I read it. And if I look at it and I see where, hey, this evidence hasn't been processed since 1990, there's a great chance we're going to get some good, viable DNA out of this evidence. Then I call them back and I say, look, we're going to do A, B, and C. We're going to submit some evidence. And we have gotten great DNA profiles that we would have never gotten had we not gotten that phone call from a family member.
Yeah, I feel like that's so important because especially in a big city where you have, hundreds upon hundreds of cold case homicides, you can't know which one to grab off the shelf, and so it's kind of luck of the draw. You pull it, you look, you review it, and then you either, you have something to follow up on or you don't, but and that kind of leads me to my next question of, in those situations where it doesn't lead to anything, where the evidence doesn't come back with the DNA profile, or it's only a partial profile, or even it gets uploaded to CODIS, but there's no hits. What do you recommend a family does? One, do you sit down with them once that time has come, and you've again reached another point where there's nothing left you can do in today's time with today's technology? You've brought it up to the current investigative standards, and it's going to go back on the shelf at least until new evidence is found, or a witness comes forward, or or any of those things. Do you sit down with those families, and what do you tell them their next step should be?
Well, those are the difficult ones, and your question was multi-pointed. So
sorry about that, Darrell.
But there were like two questions. One is, let's say you do have a DNA profile, but he's not in CODIS.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, my next step would be to try forensic genetic genealogy. If you have a good profile, they're not in CODIS. But let's put that aside, because that's rare that you're going to have that. So you process all the evidence and you get no DNA profile. Those are the hard ones, because that's when you really have to tell the family, look, we've processed every little piece of evidence we can process. And with today's science, we can't do anything more with the evidence. We have no witnesses. We have no evidence right now. But, when I first started doing this, I used to tell families, we just keep hoping science will catch up to the case.
Yeah.
And, fortunately, we've solved 2 cases with genealogy now. So it really did catch up to those cases.
Yeah.
Because we had DNA profiles, but we had no suspect.
Yeah.
That was just luck that we did that, though. But we don't know what technology is right around the corner. And I talked recently with Andy Singer at Bodie about what was coming, what's new, what do they see coming around the corner. And he talked a little bit about mixtures, and there's some new work being done with DNA mixtures. So, for a family member that has had detailed conversations with the detective, and the detective might say, well, we've got a DNA profile, but it's a mixture. And right now there's nothing we can do with it. Well, have faith that maybe a year from now, or a year and a half from now, they're going to be able to separate those mixtures and tell you who the suspect is. I mean, I don't really have great answers to tell people when the answers aren't what they want to hear.
And we've talked about this privately, a couple of times, and for families, any information is good information. Obviously it's not what we want to hear sometimes, but when you do sit down with them and there's no new evidence that can be tested, like say there's a mixture like you were just describing, do you let the family know, like, hey, there's DNA, but it's unusable right now? Do you get any more detailed than that? Do you get less detailed than that? Do you give, and I think where I'm going with this. We had a situation where a family didn't know that DNA had been tested in 2003. It was like a 1980s case, and the DNA was not tested. It was finally tested in 2003, but the family didn't know. Fast forward to a few years ago, the family comes to us and they're looking for help, and we encourage them to reach out to law enforcement. We reach out to law enforcement, and we get them to pull the file to just take a look and see if anything can be done. And they see we had a partial profile in 2003. Well, technology has really grown since then. Let's rerun that evidence. They get a full profile. They run it through CODIS now, and they get a hit. And thankfully, this suspect was incarcerated somewhere else for a couple of decades and had not been, out on the street and on the loose. But I couldn't help but think, if the family had been told in 2003 that, like, we have DNA, but we don't have enough DNA, that maybe in 2008, or 2010, the family would have come back, and whether the detective had retired or transferred or promoted or whatever, they could have said, well, last time we spoke to the investigator, there was DNA, but there wasn't anything they can do with it. And that would have generated, that case being pulled, looked at again, and potentially being solved a decade earlier than it was.
Yeah, we generally share things like that with family members, what we're going to do. The only time we're a little bit more tight-lipped is if someone in the family could possibly be a suspect in a crime. And we do have a couple of cases where we do suspect some family members. So we have to be a little more careful about what we share, because you can understand where if a family member is suspect in a murder, that you're a little more reluctant to give every piece of information, because that could affect the integrity of your case should you ever be able to make it. But that's usually not going to be the case. So generally we'll talk to families about, we've got this evidence and this is what we plan on doing with it. And it does kind of give them a little bit of ownership of thinking, hey, I know what's going on. I've got something to look forward to. And then if you do get positive results, you can share that and say, look, now our results either do tell us something or they don't tell us something. But it does give us another box to step on to move forward.
Yeah. Well, and I know we've already been going for 45 minutes, so I got a couple more things I wanted to hit on, and then we'll go and we can do this again, right, Darrell? You're not retiring anytime soon. So.
Well, it depends on Angela.
Come on, Angela. keep them working. So this was just one of the most recent comments. I think it was, when does DNA testing start on unidentified bodies? And this may or may not be in your wheelhouse, but this is something that obviously has become important in investigations. For years, we have unidentified bodies stacking up, in coroners' offices and medical examiners' offices. Mm-hmm. And now we have NamUs out there, and there's grants available, again, through the government to use the DNA of these unidentified remains and try to identify them, whether they're victims of homicide or, indigent people that, have passed on of natural causes, in the woods, or suicide somewhere in the woods. But what do you guys do with unidentified remains? And has that crossed your paths in cold cases?
It has, and it's just recently crossed our paths. So to answer your question, up until probably 2 years ago, I don't think a whole lot was being done with unidentified remains. And I see that comment there.
Yeah, that's staying up there for a few minutes.
but recently, what we've done is we started working with our medical examiner's office, and we're doing DNA work to do genealogy on our unidentified remains to try to identify first who that person is. And generally speaking, if they're unidentified remains, they're probably going to be pretty decomposed. So the chances of there being a really good crime scene are minimal. But the key thing is to find out who that person was. And so just recently, we've been working on 8 cases here in Charlotte where we had unidentified remains. And I know that we're outsourcing all of the DNA to do genealogy so that we can try to identify these individuals. That's the first step. Once we identify those individuals, there may be a reason why they were the victim of foul play. Once you start talking to family members and they say something like, yeah, they were in a toxic relationship or something like that, but that might lead you to an investigation. But I have to admit that prior to a couple of years ago, prior to genealogy, there wasn't a whole lot you could do on unidentified remains once you eliminated all of the clues. And we had a young girl's decomposed body found here in Charlotte on the side of the interstate, and all we could identify was a Virginia Beach shirt. And we worked that to death. We tried to find every connection to Virginia Beach. We contacted Virginia Beach to see who their missing persons, did anybody fit? We worked with anthropologist, forensic anthropologist, but we got nowhere. So now we do have another tool in our tool belt
Yeah, and I know NamUs is a huge part of that. Just having a database of unidentified remains where families can submit, if they have somebody that's missing, because Amanda here just said, let me see here, her uncle went missing in '76, but was entered as a missing person in 2021. This is how those unidentified remains are cases, or these are how those remains are being identified. And then, again, it opens up an entire opportunity for an investigation, because if you don't know who the victim is, where do you even start in trying to solve the crime? But all of a sudden, if you have a victim's identity, then you can start to look at who their friends were, who their relationships were with, who they worked with. It opens a lot of doors for an investigation in a homicide.
And we do have a great working relationship with Carrie, who you know well. Carrie Sutherland's our NamUs associate from this region. And we get all of our unidentified remains entered into NamUs. And so now we can get the DNA profile put into NamUs, as well as, the general basics. And again, and I know I sound like a broken record, but VICAP also has a section specifically for unidentified remains. So if your loved one is missing, one of the main things you want to make sure is that your detectives enter that missing person's data into VICAP, so that VICAP and NamUs can pair together to try to identify them to any remains that show up throughout the country.
Yeah, and we're getting a couple of questions now. I don't want to get too deep into something, but do you go back and test bodies? And and a lot of this depends on what the medical examiner or coroner's office did with unidentified remains. They may have been buried in a pauper's grave in a city cemetery somewhere. They may have been cremated, which obviously is a problem for going back and getting DNA. Somebody asked about bringing a body up after 25 years, and yes, that can be done. You can exhume a body and try to retrieve DNA from the bones or from the teeth or from whatever biological material might be left.
Yeah,
but
recently, Ryan, I know you know Tom McAndrew, right?
I do, yeah.
So Tom recently has done some studies on that very same thing. So I've kind of been talking to Tom a little bit about exhuming unidentified remains to rework the DNA.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a new thing too. But
well, that helps, because Tom is actually going to come on and be one of our live guests in like 2 weeks. So Tom is scheduled to come on, and we'll definitely talk to him about the unidentified. I want to close out. I didn't want to leave without, somebody asked a question earlier, and it wasn't the same question I had written, but Jennifer asked, does any one case haunt you? And I had written a question, is there an interaction with a victim's family that just stands out to you from over the years? And I think, our survivors would appreciate hearing from you, that these cases do impact you, and you do have memories of families. I had a detective, he's a cold case detective in Miami-Dade, and he called me a couple of weeks ago, and they had pulled him up on a hot case that was high profile, that was a little bit outside of Miami, but the suspect was from Miami. And he called me up and he told me, he said, we got a press conference and we did all of this and we hung out, we had this whole thing on press conference and I got all this publicity and everything. And he said, and the thing that stuck out to me was the victim's mother. When I was introduced to her, she just grabbed me and hugged me and thanked me. And he said, that's what stuck out. All the cameras and all the hype, and it was a great case to solve. It was a horrible case. And he did that, and that stuck out to him. And I thought, man, that's why I know there's some good ones out there in the field.
Yeah. Obviously the gratitude and the relief and I don't want to use the word closure, because I'm not a big believer in that closure happens like that, but just knowing that someone can rest a little bit easier by knowing that everything they've thought about over the last decade or 2 decades, now they have answers to it. But as far as the case that's followed me, she's on the wall behind me. It's a 7-year-old girl, and she was murdered when I was in the police academy. So ever since the day I became a detective, I've had her picture hanging on my wall. to remind me why we all do this job. And, you know, I tell everybody that comes through here, you should keep pictures of the people around you to remind you that you don't just come to work to draw a paycheck. There are people behind you that rely on you to do your job right and to do a good job.
Absolutely. I love it, Darrell. I think that's a great way to end this episode of Facebook Live. I want to thank you, not just for joining us today, because obviously this was a wealth of information, but for everything that you have done for cold cases, homicide and sexual assault over the years and continue to do. Thank you. It means so much to us on this side of it, you know, and to know there's people like you out there. And I see Chris commented and John commented earlier and Angela. I mean, we've got an amazing group of individuals that are trying everything they can to resolve these cases. And I'm proud to be a small part of that and to at least be a voice for families. And so thank you, Darrell. I look forward to seeing you soon in person. And if possible, maybe we'll revisit this and have another conversation in the near future.
Absolutely, Ryan. Anytime. And thanks everybody for your comments. I hope I get a chance to look them over before they all disappear.
Yeah, no, they'll be on there. They'll be up on our Facebook page. Anybody that missed it can go back and rewatch it. And all the comments will be there. Feel free to respond to any. I did not read all of them. I couldn't, like Darrell said, it's really hard to kind of look over here at the side of the computer and be able to see everything. Some of them were pretty detailed. So I apologize if we didn't get to them, but we'll try to go back and respond as we can. And thank you again, Darrell. If you join us next Wednesday, I think it's going to be in the evening, but next Wednesday, we're going to have Kelly Sigler from Cold Justice on to talk about prosecuting cold cases and how her show and how she helps in that arena. And then the week after that, we're going to have Tom McAndrew on, who's retired Pennsylvania State Police and is a board member for the VDOC Society, and obviously an expert in unidentified remains. And so we'll be able to talk to him some about that. So take care, Darrell. It was great to see you. Thank you again. And I will talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Bye, everybody.